As the Baskerville hounds drew their swords and launched a relentless assault on Andromalius's neck, inflicting severe damage, he writhed in agony. Meanwhile, Vikir, Hugo, and the rest observed in silence. Andromalius disclosed his ability to replenish magical power through blood absorption, disguised as Seth. Meanwhile, the river's blood began to warm up. Witnessing this, Vikir instructed the Baskerville hounds to dip into the poison river to aid the wounded. Gradually, a growing number of Baskerville hounds picked up speed, swiftly closing in on Andromalius. However, he clarified to them that by doing so, they wouldn't be assisting the demon. With a commanding gesture, he drew the attention of all the Baskerville hunting hounds, and, while locking eyes fiercely with Andromalius, issued a stern order for them to avoid injury. Upon receiving the command, the hounds were filled with fury, their pace quickening as they advanced towards Andromalius with a deadly intent in their eyes. Meanwhile, at the cliff's edge where Hugo and the others stood, Boston Terrier observed Vikir attentively. With a smile, he casually slipped his hands into his pockets and remarked to his brothers that Vikir had instantly rallied the spirits of the hounds. As Great Ledane observed Vikir, he tucked his hands behind his back and remarked with a smile to his brothers that he hadn't realized his beloved nephew possessed such commanding prowess. Meanwhile, Hugo stood in silence, hands clasped behind his back. Then, fixing his gaze firmly on Andromalius, he disclosed to them that he had failed to recognize that his own son had transformed into a demon. As he surveyed the scene, he inquired of his brothers if this was the present state of affairs within Baskerville. Meanwhile, Andromalius, impaled by the Baskerville hound's swords, uttered curses upon them all. Then he spread his hands outward, his fingers morphing into serpents. Slowly, the snakes slithered towards the hounds, launching their attacks. Unfortunately for him, outnumbered by the bloodhounds, they swiftly severed the heads of the snakes. Gathering momentum, they launched another assault on Andromalius, thrusting their swords into his body once more, eliciting agonized contortions from him. As the serpent heads gradually littered the ground, Andromalius realized that everyone confronted him without hesitation, despite the peril posed by the abilities of a high-ranking demon like himself. It didn't take him long to recognize these as the Baskerville hunting dogs, and he marveled at the extent of their abilities, surpassing even his own imagination. Swiftly, he began to contemplate his options, realizing that employing healing abilities would only deplete his magical reserves. Determined to extricate himself from this predicament, he hastily sought a means of escape. With his eyes gradually closing, Andromalius focused his gaze on Osiris, whose hand rested on his sword. He believed Osiris held the key. Andromalius proposed a deal to Vikir and Hugo. As they listened, Osiris met his gaze, contemplating the demon's intentions. Meanwhile, the Baskerville hounds forced Andromalius to his knees, restraining him and positioning two swords near his neck. Directly locking eyes with Vikir, Andromalius laid out his proposition. Spare his life, and he would vacate Seth's body immediately. He challenged Vikir, questioning whether he intended to discard the family's second son so readily. Initially, Vikir's gaze dropped to the ground, puzzled by Andromalius's words. Then, with a fierce glare, he returned the stare, questioning Andromalius's belief that Baskerville would entertain such a negotiation. Andromalius's expression underwent a dramatic shift. With tightly clenched teeth, he locked eyes with Vikir and conceded that Vikir was correct in his assessment. He knew well enough that their proposition wouldn't find favor with them. However, he recognized that within their midst, there was only one individual who might entertain such an offer. As the Baskerville hounds held their swords at his neck, Andromalius fixed his gaze toward the mountaintop and summoned Osiris. He questioned whether Osiris would stand by and allow his younger brother, who had faithfully followed him, to perish. Osiris responded by resting his hand on his sword, maintaining a silence that spoke volumes. Andromalius speculated that if his assumption was accurate, Osiris embodied the kindness within the Baskerville family. He believed that by understanding Osiris's mindset thoroughly, there might still be hope for salvation. Gazing into Osiris's eyes, he smiled and conveyed that this was the final opportunity to reclaim Seth. Upon processing this, Osiris pondered for a moment, then swiftly descended to the ground, landing directly behind Vikir. With deliberate steps, he approached Andromalius, his movements adding a palpable tension to the atmosphere. As Vikir locked eyes with Andromalius, he cautioned Osiris not to be swayed, as the demon's words were likely deceitful. He continued to advance until he stood beside the demon, who was restrained by the Baskerville hounds. Osiris met Andromalius's gaze, observing the demon's demeanor closely. With a solemn tone, Osiris conveyed that if even a fragment of his beloved brother Seth's soul lingered within Andromalius, it fell upon him, as the elder brother, to undertake the task of rescuing him. He inquired if there remained any possibility for him to assist his younger brother. Andromalius's countenance underwent a gradual transformation as he gazed downward, a smile playing upon his lips, incredulous at the success of his ploy. Suddenly, he altered his visage to resemble Seth's, a cunning maneuver to deceive Osiris. Raising his head, he rested a hand upon his chest, locking eyes with Osiris with a mournful expression. Addressing him as his elder brother, he revealed that he was still alive within. Tears welled in Andromalius's eyes as he pleaded for forgiveness, confessing to having bargained his soul to the demon. He recounted the years of enduring comparison and evaluation by Hugo, describing the struggle of constantly feeling inferior to his older sibling, which had left him feeling profoundly weak. Hugo fixed his gaze on Andromalius, his silence speaking volumes. He expressed genuine remorse for bartering his soul to a demon, acknowledging that the chaos that had unfolded was his responsibility. Tears welled in his eyes as he implored Osiris for a chance to redeem himself, seeking an opportunity to make amends for his transgressions. Before Andromalius could conclude his plea, Osiris swiftly drew his sword and, with a decisive stroke, severed the demon's head. With a solemn gaze fixed on the ground, Osiris conveyed to Seth that this act was the only recourse available, urging him not to harbor any regrets. Andromalius's head dropped to the ground, casting a somber pall over the scene as a pool of blood swiftly pooled around it. With his waning strength, he gazed aside, pondering why Osiris, after closing his eyes and sheathing his sword, walked past Vikir. Meeting Osiris's gaze, Vikir implored him not to burden himself with guilt, assuring him that Seth's soul had already departed. He also disclosed to him that the voice they had been hearing was actually the demon manipulating Seth's soul. Osiris, wearing a forlorn and pained expression, directed his gaze downward, confessing to Vikir that he bore the blame for giving the demon an opening to influence Seth. Reflecting on his youth, he lamented that had he provided better guidance and protection for Seth, none of this tragedy would have transpired. As they gazed upon the remnants of the children's skeletons, consumed by the demon, Osiris conveyed that it was premature to mourn the loss of one of their brethren. He expressed sorrow at the fate of the children, who were meant to be the future of the Baskerville territory, but had instead become sacrificial victims. He admitted to everyone that as the head of a small household, he felt ashamed for not having been aware of the situation until now. Vikir, upon hearing this, lowered his gaze to the ground, acknowledging the truth in his older brother's words. As they both looked towards the lake, Osiris confided in Vikir, revealing that he had been unaware of how he unwittingly played into the demon's hands. In that instant, one of the hounds glanced upward, drawing the attention of the others. As Vikir and Osiris followed its gaze, they witnessed Andromalius's head sprouting bat-like wings and starting to ascend. With a mocking smile, Andromalius looked down at Osiris and Vikir, derisively referring to them as foolish hounds as he flew away. Then, locking eyes with Hugo, he smirked and disclosed to all present that delaying the door's opening was within his power, rendering their efforts futile. He further stated that his fellow demons, his brethren, would handle the task of opening the door. With a menacing promise, he vowed to return and eliminate them all once he had regained his strength. Vikir swiftly pivoted toward the demon, his fists clenched tightly, and as he watched Andromalius soar away, he embraced Osiris. His teeth gritted with frustration, he realized he had no means to strike from such a distance. Osiris, too, shifted his gaze towards Andromalius, meeting his eyes in silence, withholding any verbal response. At that instant, Hugo seized Seth's attention, reminding him of the principle he had instilled, that a swordsman never shows his back. With a slight turn of his head towards the demon, his eyes burning with fury, he addressed him as his dear son. Andromalius, upon hearing these words and sensing the intensity of Hugo's gaze, was overcome with profound terror. As Hugo fixed his gaze upon Andromalius, his aura brimming with potent mana, he gradually drew his sword from its sheath. Observing this, Andromalius, the demon, found himself perplexed by the sensation enveloping him. He speculated that Seth's presence might have completely dissipated. Yet, he couldn't shake off the lingering fear of Hugo that still gripped his mind. As Hugo cast his intense gaze upon Andromalius, a visible trail of smoke began to drift from his mouth. Andromalius suddenly grasped that this sensation was the embodiment of raw dread in the face of formidable strength. Meanwhile, Hugo's figure radiated potent and overwhelming mana as he drew his sword, leaving all witnesses in Baskerville awestruck by its incredible power. Vikir and Osiris observed silently as Hugo assumed an offensive stance, directing his attack towards the airborne Andromalius. As moonlight pierced through the clouds, Andromalius recalled something significant. Turning to face Hugo, he met his gaze with a smile, explaining that regardless of Hugo's swordsmanship prowess, it was futile to believe his strikes could reach the skies. With lightning speed, Hugo delivered a devastating blow towards the demon, slicing through parts of the mountain with unstoppable force. Andromalius, caught off guard, attempted to speak, but before he could utter a word, Hugo's strike severed his head into fragments, leaving him bewildered. As the shattered pieces of his head disintegrated into dust and drifted to the ground, Andromalius couldn't fathom how a mere human possessed such incredible power. Hugo stood gazing at the sky, his silence carrying a weighty presence. Vikir's eyes remained fixed on Hugo, recognizing the unmistakable power of the swordsman, Hugo Le Baskerville. The force of Hugo's strike was so immense that it cleaved the very clouds asunder. Within moments, the demon's head vanished, obliterated by Hugo's overwhelming strength. As the remnants of Andromalius's head drifted down, illuminated by the moon's glow, Vikir contemplated the awe-inspiring might wielded by a true master swordsman.